Today we'll be talking about a very interesting meteorological phenomenon and how significant it is when we talk about commercial aviation or aviation in general. It's to do with thunderstorms and the hazards that they pose to aviation. Before we start talking about the actual hazards or the threats over here, let's take a quick moment to understand what creates thunderstorms. It's quite an interesting meteorological phenomenon. So that's our thunderstorm cloud. Once again, excuse my drawing. But for the creation of a thunderstorm cloud, also referred to as a cumulonimbus cloud, it's one of the clouds that would cause thunderstorms. There are three things that are needed. One, instability in the atmosphere. We wouldn't actually get into what causes instability or how do we define instability, because it's a whole different subject. But let's just consider one of the factors as instability in the atmosphere for the creation of a thunderstorm cloud. Two, there needs to be plenty of moisture in the air. And three is a triggering force, which we'll look into more detail in just a second. So once these three things come together, we've then got the recipe for the creation of a thunderstorm cloud. Now, let's look at the triggering force, the third requirement, in a bit more detail. What do we mean by triggering force? We're talking about something that would take this warm, moist air upward into the atmosphere. So an uplift. And there are two ways in which this usually occurs. One is through an intermixing of air masses, different air masses, which usually would occur in winter months. These air masses are also referred to as fronts in meteorological phenomenon terms. And the other way the triggering force would occur is through convection. So the lifting of that warm, moist air as a result of the heating of the ground. So in the summer months, when the terrain gets heated and it's heating the air just above it, this hot air then begins to rise up in the atmosphere, because hot air is lighter than cold air, which descends. Now what happens is, as this warm, moist air is ascending, or it's going up in the atmosphere, we have to remember that as we go up in the atmosphere, the temperature drops. And as this moist air is going up in the atmosphere and it's being subject to colder temperatures, it causes condensation. So that moisture, or water in vapor state or gaseous state, then starts turning into a liquid state. That's called condensation. And that's what creates clouds. So three things again: instability in the atmosphere, plenty of moisture, and a triggering force, which would then take that warm, moist air up into the atmosphere, cause a condensation that would create a cloud. So that's, once again, a very high-level overview of what a thunderstorm cloud, how it would be created. And thunderstorm clouds can actually grow as high as the tropopause, which is the transition layer between the troposphere and the stratosphere. These are the layers of the atmosphere. So yeah, they may actually go all the way up to 40 or even 50,000 feet. That's the top of the cloud over there. So having looked at the thunderstorm cloud and how it's created, now let's take a deeper look into the hazards that thunderstorms pose to commercial aviation, specifically aircraft. So the first one is severe turbulence. As we mentioned, there is a vigorous movement of the air inside the cloud. And so if an aircraft were to fly inside this, it would be subject to that highly disturbed air mass movement inside the cloud, and therefore it would be subject to severe turbulence, which can be quite dangerous for the aircraft for a couple of reasons. It could stress the airframe. Although aircraft are designed to withstand quite a bit of stress, nonetheless, it could stress the airframe. It could also result in a temporary loss of control of the aircraft, which can be, quite a startling event for the pilots. And it would also be very uncomfortable for the passengers, and sometimes severe turbulence can result in injuries, to passengers and crew, particularly if they are not seated, they don't have their seatbelts on, those kind of things. And of course, loose objects flying around, again, posing a hazard. So it's quite a dangerous thing to encounter. The other hazard that thunderstorms constitute is icing. Because thunderstorm clouds contain something called supercooled water droplets. These are water droplets that are at sub-zero temperatures, but they're still in a liquid state. They haven't turned into ice because of the lack of a host, if you like. They need a nuclei. But again, just to simplify, they need a host to turn into ice. However, that's not there, and so they remain in a liquid state. However, the temperature is below 0 degrees. And what happens as an aircraft flies through a cloud that contains all these supercooled water droplets? As soon as these water droplets come into contact with the airframe, they've got a host, and so they freeze. They turn into ice. That's what causes icing. And a threat that the icing would pose is, as icing starts to build up on the wings and some other parts of the airframe, it would interfere with the aerodynamics of the aircraft. So, the airflow with the wings. That's number one. Number two, icing effectively increases the weight of the aircraft, and therefore it increases what we refer to as the stall speed. Again, without getting too technical, it's quite a hazard. So that will, that's something we need to avoid as well. The third risk that we face if we were to fly into a thunderstorm cloud is hail, particularly the larger hail, because that would potentially cause severe structural damage, which can be quite detrimental. Fourth risk, lightning. Now, what happens is when a cloud or a cumulonimbus cloud forms, it's got a lot of, because of this vigorous air movement and between the supercooled water droplets and even ice crystals, the friction occurs. And when friction occurs, what does it create in the process? Static electricity. So there is a buildup of static charge on these supercooled water droplets and the ice crystals. And at a certain point, when there is too much of a differential in the charge, a discharge occurs, and that's exactly what causes lightning. And should an aircraft be subject to lightning, it could potentially cause some damage to the airframe, which again is something that needs to be avoided. The fifth threat we have here is water ingestion. There is a huge amount of water content in these clouds, and as an aircraft flies through them, the engines would ingest all that water, and sometimes the volume of the water that the engines would ingest could exceed the limit at which they were certified, or what they were actually designed to withstand. And this could potentially lead to an engine flame out, as we would refer to them in aviation terms. An engine flame out in simple terms is an engine shutting down in flight. And the sixth one is wind shear and microbursts, which are again a threat associated with cumulonimbus clouds. Now, wind shear in simple terms is a sudden change in wind direction and or speed. When the sudden shift in the wind direction, so where the wind is coming from, occurs, or there is a sudden change in the speed of the wind, that would affect the aerodynamics of the aircraft again, because it suddenly changes things around the aircraft. And that's exactly what wind shear is referred to as. This is quite a threat, particularly at low altitudes, so during takeoffs and landings, because the aircraft is so close to the ground that if it were to encounter a wind shear, it could be very dangerous. And so there are procedures that we as pilots are trained on to execute should we be ever faced with the wind shear at low altitudes. But again, this is something that's very dangerous because it can suddenly cause an aircraft to lose lift. So you've got an aircraft that's in flight, and due to a sudden change in the wind direction and or speed, it could cause a change in the lift characteristics of the aircraft, and therefore make it even sink. Crashes have actually occurred as a result of planes encountering wind shear. It's so dangerous. Microbursts ties in with wind shear, but what essentially microbursts are. Now, imagine this cloud once again, and during a certain stage, what will happen is there'll be a lot of downdrafts, as they're referred to. So this is the air descending through the cloud, and imagine this is the ground. Now what will happen is the air would hit the ground and it would spread across. Now, if an aircraft were to encounter this high speed and very powerful wind force, again, that could be quite dangerous because it would affect the speed, the lift, the aerodynamics of the aircraft will be, quite badly impacted, and it can be very dangerous, particularly for an aircraft that's quite close to the ground. So these are some of the threats that are associated with thunderstorm type of clouds, or in other words, cumulonimbus clouds, and therefore we would avoid them. We would always avoid them. During takeoff landing, if we know that the aerodrome or the airport has thunderstorms, we would either delay the takeoff or the landing would not be made. We would probably go in a hold, wait for the thunderstorm to dissipate, or if it's expected to last longer, a diversion may even take place. But a landing would usually not be attempted if there were severe thunderstorms over the airfield because of some of these threats that thunderstorms pose. And in the cruise, so at a high altitude, if we were to see thunderstorm clouds, or if we were forecasting them along the way, we would have strategies to avoid them. We would never fly into a thunderstorm cloud. That's something that would be avoided, and it's usually avoided horizontally, so we would fly around the cloud as opposed to flying over or under the cloud. Under the cloud is even more dangerous because of what we talked about in terms of the down routes. So it's usually a horizontal deviation around the clouds that would be carried out to avoid a thunderstorm in air. So once again, I hope that was not too difficult to follow, and it made a little bit of sense. But yes, just thought we may talk about some of the threats because it's an important subject in aviation. Thanks very much, and I shall see you all in the next one. And by the way, if you have any questions or you'd like a certain subject covered, feel free to pop them in the comments and I will endeavor to cover them in a future video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification so whenever a new video comes up, you get notified. Alright, well, thanks very much again, and I shall see you all in the next one.